I started doing rods probably 25, 27 years ago. And like everybody else, probably to save some bucks and rewrap my own rods. You know, they get beat up and you think, well, it'd be cheaper to go out and get some stuff and rewrap the rod. So I rewrapped the rod, and then you think, oh, it'd be nice to kind of dress the rod up a little bit. So you start putting the cross wraps on it to dress it up and color it up. Then you decide, well, I'd like them to all look like a set. So then you start rewrapping them in your colors and doing things like that. I kind of got bored with the cross wraps and was talking to a friend of mine one day and told him I thought it'd really be neat to have a dragon that wove itself all the way around the rod. And he said, yeah, that'd be neat. Okay, this is the Wonder Weaver, and we're going to go through the process for setting it up on a rod blank. This particular blank that's in the lathe right now is one that I use for test wraps, and it obviously doesn't have any grips or reel seat on it. But I will set this up in the same fashion as though there were grips on the rod. The first thing we want to do is to protect the grip or the blank from these screws that hold the Wonder Weaver in place. So we need to take some sort of material, whether it's tape or I like to use cardboard, and protect the blank. So we'll take this and a China marker and locate approximately where the ends of the Wonder Weaver come on the blank so that we can locate those screws. And we'll take a piece of cardboard, very light, on the rod. And we put another one down at the other end. And wrap it on nice and tight. And now we can locate the left side of the Wonder Weaver on the rod. And we can check it if we want to see how close it is to being centered by taking a seam gauge, take it at each one of the screws, set the seam gauge for that one. We're going to try it for this. This one's a little bit high. Back that one off a little bit and tighten up these two. You don't want to crank those screws down real tight because it'll puncture the grip if you have a grip in there. But once we have it on nice and snug, we can move to the right side wheel. Now, the right side wheel wants to be set approximately 14 inches from where the weave is going to go. And our weave is going to go right in this area right here. So we'll measure out here 14 inches. Put another mark on the blank so we know where that is. And we'll put the right side wheel on. The difference between what we're doing here and what we did back here is we have a Hypalon grip or a cork grip underneath this. In this case, it's just the rod blank. So we can screw this down onto the blank itself, or if you're worried about putting a scratch in the blank, you can put a piece of tape under it to protect the blank. And remember that we're making these snug, not tight. You could literally crush them. So you really want to be careful about, just snugging this down so it's snug, but not to the point where you're crushing the blank. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is take some tape and put it over the blank right in front of where you're going to put the weave. I like to put a couple of wraps of the tape. This will allow me to trim the threads off when we get through with the weave and not mar the blank. And we take regular masking tape and we back it on itself, leaving the sticky side out. And that will help hold our threads in place. Okay, we'll check our distance one more time here. 14 inches right on. Now what we need to do is decide where we're going to put this weave on the rod. So let's say that we want our subject matter, whatever it is that we're going to do, on this part of the rod. So I like to use, if we've lined that up and we've found the axis that we want to do that on, I will take something and mark that axis. On the tape and out here on the rod. Now that we've got the two halves of the Wonder Weaver on the rod, we need to set it up so that it matches the pattern that we're going to weave with it. So obviously we need to have the center thread in our pattern centered on the axis on the rod that we're going to use. I've marked the rod and marked the center line and a center line here. And that has to correspond with the number of thread that is in the center of the pattern. On this particular pattern, that's going to be thread number 66. So that means that the Wonder Weaver has to have this number 66 line up with the center line on the pattern. Patterns, you steal patterns from wherever you can. In other words, I'm by no means an artist, and I will copy patterns, for instance, from tattoos. Tattoos make excellent patterns. Put those into the computer and turn them into a cross-stitch pattern. I have a cross-stitch program in the computer, and I can decide how many pattern threads I want, and I can blow that picture up to accommodate a particular number of threads. And then I'll come through and color each one of those and print it out, and you get what you see behind me in either case, either all black, such as the dragon over here, or the one that I've colored so that I can tell what color threads I want where. So, and the style of pattern makes a big difference in how well the finished product looks. And it takes time and it takes practice. And once you learn to accommodate what the medium will allow, then you can produce some really beautiful work. So we loosen this up a little bit. And to make sure, I'll take a piece of thread, put it in slot 66, and in slot 66, and in slot 66 down here. And then we'll take a straight edge and see if those line up. It looks good. And then we'll snug this down a little bit. The next thing to do is to load thread on the rod. And you'll see that there is a center line here, and we start in the center and then work out in both directions. So we can do this either by hand, or we can wrap up a bunch of thread at one time and tape it on. This is a much easier way than putting them on one at a time. And what I've got is a piece of plastic that's 8 inches long. So if I double this, I get a strand when I cut it off here that is 16 inches long, which is what I'm looking for when I set up the Wonder Weaver. You can use embroidery thread that you can go to a store and buy. My suggestion would be to use silky or sulky, and use the finer threads, not the cheap stuff. Sewing thread you could use, but it doesn't produce a very fine weave. It's too fuzzy. So you end up with a very fuzzy weave that isn't very sharp and very clear. Good broad fish hawk, which is YLI, all make threads that are designed specifically for working on weaving on rods, for doing the cross wraps and the weaves. And so it is thread that is specifically designed for it, and it comes in not only a number of standard colors, but metallics as well. And what we're going to do is set this up for a color change weave. So which means we're going to have more than one color of thread on the rod. For instance, in this particular pattern, there are 5 different colors. So if we're going to weave that pattern, then we would have to locate all of those 5 different colors and put those on the blank before we ever start. What I'm going to do now is wrap this down so I don't pull threads out while I'm weaving. Very often when I get ready to do a weave that is as involved as this particular weave, I'll come in one evening, set the rod up, set the Wonder Weaver up, and get all the threads on the rod, and then knock it off for the day. Come back a day later and go ahead and start the weave. So the setup process with regard to putting all of the threads on the rod can take an evening. It can take a little while to get them all on there, especially if you're trying to load up 5 different colors. So the way this works is to lay out your pattern threads or your design threads on a piece of tape, tape it down, and stretch them out to the right. As you weave, by looking at this pattern, each one of these little X's represents a thread. The number of that thread is also on this wheel, it is on this wheel, and it is on this wheel. So thread number 60, for example, at this point in this pattern is green. But as we follow it on down, we see that thread 60 changes to red. And then it changes back to green again. Number 60 is still the number 60 thread, so we stack up thread colors in each one of these slots. So number 60 thread can go from green to red, and it could change to orange or yellow if we wanted it to. So that way we can do on this what is called a color change weave. So what we do is come back to this point, and on this particular pattern I am at turn number 35, and I have gone to a point where I'm at thread number 85. So we take thread number 85 at turn 35 is a green thread, and we follow that down and we get from 85 to 92 are green. So we come over here and we see, okay, 85 is in there. We come up to 91, but 92 isn't in there. So we come over to the right side and pick up threads 92. We'll take the green thread out, put the red thread back in, and put the green thread in the pattern. Okay, for instance here, you can see that these blue threads no longer show in the pattern out here. So they're the claws, and you can see them right in here. There's the blue, and there's the second claw and the third claw. When you bring them back to the right, they will be over the top of the wrapping thread, which is the background. So all of these threads that you see in the back here that are part of this pattern were taken to the left, and they're in the pattern. As soon as they're brought back to the right, then the wrapping thread goes over the top of them, so they're no longer in the pattern. So they only show where they can lie over the top of the background threads. And in this case right here, this particular thread showed for 1, 2, 3, 4 turns. They're right down here, right at the base of this claw. Okay, then we come down here and we see that our next thread is thread 94 to thread 97, and we'll pick those threads up. And they are blue, and they're already in there. I can go back if for instance, I put threads back and I put them back in the wrong slot. You know, I don't know how often I do that, but it's an easy thing to do, especially if you get distracted. So instead of putting the thread back in slot 110, let's say I put it back in 101. And then I discovered that I've made that mistake, or at least I've discovered that I have made a mistake. But I really don't know where that thread belonged, because I'm not sure I've made the mistake. There is a color list on the pattern that tells me what thread numbers are blue. So I can go back to all of the other numbers and see if they're there. And then I find that, gee, there was no 101 blue thread. It belongs in 111. So I can take it back and put it back where it belongs, and making sure that the others are in sequence. The other thing is that when you get ready to put the thread on the rod in the first place, when you're setting up for the weave, those thread numbers 10 through 15, if they are to be blue, have to be directly over the top of 10 through 15 green, and maybe 10 and 11 orange. So we have to know exactly where they go. So when I put those threads on the rod itself, I will pick up the thread underneath, say thread number 10, and let's say it's green. So I'll pick up green, mark it on a piece of tape that's holding it in place, and then take thread number 10 blue and lay it right on top of it, so that as those threads stack up in color, when I pick them up, they all come up as a group and they're very close together. Okay, so we have thread 94, 95, 96, and 97. They're already in. So then we go to our next one, which is down here, and that is thread 111 blue. So we go to, and we find that 100 green is in there, but it's no longer in the pattern. So it comes back to the right. And we pick up thread 111. Find the blue thread in this stack. Put the others back. And put thread 111 into the pattern. The left thread wheel, the third thread wheel that is as far left as you can go on the Wonder Weaver, is a wheel that's designed to move. And the reason that it has to move is because these threads that are taken to the left get shorter and shorter as they move left, because the pattern moves out to the right. So as that pattern moves out to the right, this part of the Wonder Weaver has to move with it. So it will allow these threads to get shorter, and still you'll be able to pick them up and keep them in order. So it just slides along with the pattern, and if this pattern came out 4 inches, this thing would slide up 4 inches, so the thread can still be accommodated in this third wheel. This Wonder Weaver allows you to do, if you want to, is to do 2 patterns at the same time. For instance, I could weave this pattern that I'm weaving on the loom right now, and I could weave that pattern that's next to it at the same time by setting up the other pattern on the back side here. So I could line it up and literally weave 2 patterns at the same time, and they would come out back to back. And a 360-degree pattern, principally on a fishing rod, but it can be used to weave on any cylindrical object that you can fit it on. These are practice weaves. When you develop a pattern, they don't always look the way you expect them to. So you develop the pattern, and then you go weave it. And here's a practice weave of a dragon coming up out of flames. And I don't know if the camera can see the crystal that he's holding in his hand. But that's a particular pattern that I wasn't very happy with, so that went in the trash. A weave that I call a sea snake, done in 2 colors. Here are 2 weaves of seahorses. Those are both practice weaves, and some of those where they look like they've been drawn out and skinny and or short and fat is because of the different sizes of threads. Generally choose a background thread that is 1 size larger than the thread of the design. Because the background thread is stretched, it produces the proper proportion. This one was done on a rod for a Dodge mechanic. Here is that same weave in different colors, all done as a practice. And that's just done so that I can tell what that weave is going to look like before I put it on a rod. Is a skull and crossbones. And you'll see that just below it there's a C and D. And that tells me that the pattern was done in C and that the background was done in D. And if you look just below that, you'll see the same pattern, but done with A as the pattern thread and D with the background. And then below that is another practice of the dragon's head. And between the 2 of those, I changed the beard. You kind of have to be careful with the threads because you don't want to cut them. And sometimes you push pretty hard, and sometimes you pull pretty hard. And if you're in the middle of a long weave and you break a thread,
there's no tying a knot.
No, there's no tying a knot. So very often you either cut it all off and start over, or you try to figure out how you can put a new thread into the pattern and continue from that point. which can be done. And if you forget a thread, when you get finished, there are little tricks to adding a thread to your pattern if you need to in certain places. And put thread 111 into the pattern. Make one revolution of the rod. Then we come up here and we move this to revolution number 36. And we repeat that process all the way through until we complete that entire pattern. If you wanted a Wonder Weaver, you could go online and bring up the Renzetti Inc. website, or look in Rod Maker magazine at one of their ads and contact them, and you can order it directly from Renzetti.